Good morning, everyone. I thank everyone involved in the service today just to ease some churches that I'm helping out. The pastor kind of gets to do everything, and gets to isn't always the funnest part. I find it a lot better if we can share the load, other people involved in readings and different things, and just bringing in different gifts, and also helping when you're under pressure a little bit to prepare a message and then to deliver that as best as you can, to just sort of have that element to think about. So I appreciate that a lot here at CFC, and that different people are involved in different ways, not only Sunday mornings, but also during the week. I suggested that we read from Jonah. I didn't know that Pastor Knauer spoke on Jonah apparently recently, and that's not also my intention to speak on Jonah, but it was my intention in the reading to just point our eyes to someone that God sent with a task, and that task was to preach the gospel, to preach a message of salvation to a people that were lost, that were going in the wrong direction, and God noticed that, the scripture says, and he sent a prophet. He sent someone to speak truth into that situation and to call them out. Now, Jonah had his own challenges, his own obstacles to proclaiming that gospel, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Obstacles that can arise when we step in that gap and respond to that call that God gives his people. Jesus made that very clear throughout his ministry, but then also when he was resurrected, that he sent his disciples, his friends out, those that believe in him, to go and make disciples. You can read that at the end of Matthew chapter 28. And in all four Gospels, we have some form of mission mandate. So it's not just one text. This is Christ's last words before he departed, to then be gone a time and then come back and make all things right. So, obstacles to the gospel. I want to look at a text today that is so different from our own experience, and yet I believe, and even as I was thinking about it after I had prepared the bulk of what I wanted to do, there's even more points than what I've taken out of it. We will look at 9 obstacles that arise in this text to the gospel. Let's read it. I have it, I think, spread out on three slides, so we won't have the entire text on one. But just try and imagine what this meant for people that knew the risen Lord sent them to preach the gospel. So we find ourselves with apostles in a town called Lystra. In Lystra, there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates, because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard about this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. I don't know if you've paused on this text before. Maybe you've stumbled over it if you had a Bible reading plan. I can't recall anyone preaching on it before, but I find it fascinating. As I was reading this text, the number of hurdles that just present themselves, that pop out of the page, to me at least, I hope I can take you along. They remind me of my experience in Bangladesh and in Germany as a communicator of the gospel. It's these kinds of hurdles that need to be overcome at some level. Which obstacles do the apostles have to hurdle over for the sake of Jesus and this good news about the risen Christ? I want to start with the first one. There's 9, and I feel there are more, but I've got to keep it under control here too. So the first one is the obstacle of the apostles' own comfort zone. It was a very conscious decision by the apostles to let their sending church in Antioch send them. I'll quote to you just the verses there in Acts 13, verse 2 and 3. While the church in Antioch was worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. And this town of Lystra is one of those places they encountered then in this commissioning, in this sending. We see in the New Testament, this was a great, balanced, healthy church in Antioch. The Spirit of God worked there regularly. It was beautifully international, with Greeks and Hebrews. There were different generations with older and younger. There were different languages that would, at least in background, could have been spoken. And so you say to yourself, if you're worshiping at a grand place of worship, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Why would you leave that? Well, God called them. The church confirmed it too and sent them. Staying put is always easier than going to follow God's lead. Risking financial security or comforts of home in exchange for hard beds and bugs, and relying on the support of God's people. Don't get me wrong. My point right now is not that we all need to leave our churches and go and be elsewhere, serve the Lord elsewhere, but a preparedness for this possibility that God may want to upset our perfect little fruit basket. Well, that seems to be part of the gospel, that he may want to pull us out of our comfort zone, challenging us to recognize that he might have other thoughts for us, and that sharing Christ may cost us a bit. Now, I recognize, I think we all acknowledge, we don't all have the same comfort zones. Some of us can be quite relaxed in certain settings that can be a little nerve-wracking or almost upsetting to others. For one believer, doing something like starting a conversation with someone or giving a testimony, that can be a huge obstacle for them. For someone else, That may not be the hardest part, but maybe building friendships or practicing hospitality can be something that they kind of seize up on. They find it difficult. We're all different. We're all made differently. And I'm certain God knows that and factors that in when he looks at each one of us individually and considers his call for our lives. It's about learning as Christians to let our risen Lord and Savior challenge us with certain well-crafted hurdles placed by him for our personal growth and for the blessing of others. So our sense of security is important, but it's also an opportunity to reflect on, am I willing to let Jesus challenge me to push the boundaries of my comfort zone? And that I allow that for his purposes, for his gains, for his sake. What other obstacles do we find here? The obstacle of geographic borders. Paul and Barnabas were Christians from Palestine, the region of Israel. They are on their first missionary journey in Acts 13 and 14 and traveling hundreds of kilometers by ship and by foot to this province of Galatia. It's in Asia Minor, in modern-day Turkey. I don't know if you can imagine walking from Antioch, 100 kilometers north of Jerusalem, all the way around through Syria, and then going all the way into Turkey. They crossed these borders and physically left home. Who knows what they will eat tomorrow, let alone next week, or what bed they will sleep in, or what languages they will encounter, or what physical barriers they might have to overcome. And they faced all this uncertainty in what was for them uncharted territory. So geography can be an obstacle. A third obstacle here is the obstacle of language. The people in Lystra spoke the Lycaonian language. It's unique to that region. It was an old language of Anatolia that has since died out. The apostles, they spoke Hebrew and Greek. And where that didn't work, they probably gesticulated with hands and feet. They did whatever they could to share this message that had gripped them and changed their lives. This point of language is one. I recall a pastor in my early 20s who shared about that he was working in a factory, and a colleague of his was from Croatia. And over time, he thought, if God wants me to love this person, I want to try and learn some Croatian. And I think he was working there at least 10 years, and he figured he had time. So he began to learn Croatian, and then in the tasks of the factory, he'd practice and he'd talk to him. And by doing this, he demonstrated a love for this man. And that opened up opportunity for the gospel. If you don't try, you can't prove you love someone, at least not on that front. Maybe you have other love languages. Maybe you have other avenues that you can demonstrate that you appreciate people. But the man who later became a pastor, he shared that, and that motivated me. That played a little role too for me to say, if others have gone before us to go to difficult countries and learn a language, maybe God can help me do that too. There were obstacles of stigmas and stereotypes. The text said, in Lystra there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. Building relationships and working with people who may be poor, maybe have a physical challenge or a disability, who are maybe sick or unwell, maybe aging, people that are going through challenges like that are often faced with a helplessness from others. They don't know how to deal with them. Somebody rolls in on a wheelchair and nobody knows what to do now. Do I shake their hand? Do I bow a little? Or do I help them push? Should I go press the elevator button? What do I do? We got to figure it out. These things need to be overcome. If we want to love someone, we got to find a way. We may make some mistakes. We may stumble. Oftentimes we don't know what to say. Don't know how to approach a situation or a person, and don't have the words. But even if we don't have the words, we don't want to become paralyzed so that we don't even try. This paralyzed man probably encountered lots of paralyzed people who didn't know how to deal with them. How different the apostles here. So refreshing. They at least try. They go into this clumsiness and awkwardness, and they give it a shot. For Christ's sake, they try. The text says, Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." And at that, the man got up and jumped up and walked. I have tons of questions at this text. I can't even deal with them. How do you see in someone's eyes that they have faith to be healed? How aware do you need to be? How much love does your heart need to recognize such a moment and then to speak in the name of Christ boldly? To be there at that moment and to be used by him powerfully. How do you get to that spot? Am I that in tune with the Spirit to recognize such a moment? Oh Lord, help me to get eyes that perceive people and their need a bit more like you do. That's my prayer in the light of this verse here. Stigmas and stereotypes. There's the obstacle of differing worldviews. You maybe noticed it as I read the text, the pantheon of countless gods in Greek mythology and also in Roman mythology, all of this worldview of innumerable gods as a part of their universe, as a part of their existence, as a source of humanity's existence and being. All of this played a role here. This way of seeing themselves in the playfield of myriads of God figures. Maybe you learned some of them in school. Zeus was the god of this, and Ares was the god of that. Hermes here had a whole bunch of different roles, and one of them was being a spokesperson of the gods. So you can study the old mythologies. But what happens is when Paul and Silas open their mouths and interact with them, they begin to interpret the message they're hearing and the things they're seeing, like the healing of a man. They interpret it from their perspective, in the framework of their worldview. And all of a sudden, things go completely sideways for the apostles. This is not at all what they intended. They weren't trying to get a people's praise or something crazy like sacrifices to them and honor. They weren't the gods come down to them, as the people said. But they had to deal with this. These obstacles of worldview are a real challenge as we share who Jesus is with the world. There are many worldviews, many ways of looking at the world, and in that sense, that makes it a huge challenge for us. We can't know everything about how everyone thinks. We can't understand deeply everyone's angle and view and perspective on life and the things that matter in our existence. And yet, that's a part of that challenge, to understand where people are coming from, to listen well, and to not assume that my 4 or 5 favorite theological topics are exactly the ones that people need to hear right now. There may be other issues. There may be other angles of expressing what my faith means to me to someone who's listening from a certain perspective. Not easy. We see here a cultural obstacle come up, and I'm sure there were more than just what the text says. Culture is a huge topic for missionaries. For anyone who wants to be missional, who wants to be evangelistic in their surroundings, no matter where they live. I'll only touch it briefly here, but the people, they're saying here that they saw this amazing act of healing and they instinctively figured they were in the presence of the gods. I mean, how else do you explain it? This man from birth wasn't fully functional as the rest of mankind was, had his issues, and now all of a sudden it's gone. Changed in the twinkling of an eye in the powerful word. It must be a god. Let's build an idol. We're in the presence of gods. That's how they figured. That's how they made sense of that moment. And so they begin to prepare things like bowls and wreaths to honor these gods in their presence. That made sense in their culture. We have the obstacle of religious views, religious practices, sacrificing to gods. We don't slay animals these days, at least not in the West typically, to commemorate things or to honor things. We don't sacrifice animals in these ways, but there are places in the world even today that still do that. The text said the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bowls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer them sacrifices. In real life here in multicultural Canada, as in the global mission endeavor, culture, religion, language, all these things, ethnicity, they're all kind of intermingled and complicated to figure out, to understand. Many things are linked so strongly together. You can say religion, but often language comes with, and so do certain cultural practices. It makes for a lot of reading and studying and asking people questions and making mistakes and trying again. So what do the apostles do? They don't entertain 1 second of being made into gods. They have to unload a spontaneous sermon right there and then. Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We're bringing you good news. And then they speak that message, trying to describe to them that God was patient with them. There is a God, but it's a little different than what you've been taught. He's above all gods. He made all things. He's not in some kind of sexual fantasy like many of the gods they knew. He's not a vindictive God, and he's not moody, and he doesn't come and disappear and then come again and no one knows. He's different. He gives you sustenance for life, rain and crops and seasons, and fills your hearts with joy. So they do what they can at that moment to share what they could in ways that the people could understand. And with all of these sermons in Acts, we can be sure we're only getting the main bullet points. The full gospel here wasn't presented in this defensive sermon about Christ and crucifixion, and he was raised to life again, and he went back and is enthroned on high and will come back again and will judge all people, will make all things right. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. They didn't unload all of those truths. But they said at that moment what was necessary. So even from this sermon, which I don't want to expand on now, there's a lot to learn from. But that would require another meditation. An eighth obstacle I see here is that personal boundaries got crossed. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. The adverse reaction to the gospel by evil religious leaders led to a mob being riled up, an unthinkable physical abuse. What torment did Paul have to go through? What suffering? I had a hard object hit me just above the eyebrow when I was a teen. And it swelled up, and if somebody hadn't put some pressure against it, it would have burst open in an ugly scar. In that way, he pushed it down and dissipated the bleeding underneath, and so now I'm just the face I have. It could have been worse. What is it like to be hit by multiple stones so often and so terribly that the aggressors assume it's enough, he's dead? That's a whole other league I have no clue about. A clear gospel message may evoke resistance. There may be a strong counter-reaction. We don't know. The man that was healed, his eyes were apparently enough for Paul to know, I think God is kindling faith here. But some may have a very strong reaction, like hurling stones, rejecting a message, rejecting the messenger, rejecting him who sent the messenger. And so they drag Paul outside the city and toss him away as if dead. So personal boundaries were crossed here. That's an obstacle. I don't know how comfortable we are to consider where is your limit for what you're willing to have happen to you for Christ. Is there a line in the sand for you, Lord? I'll go this far, but I can't go further. I think it's okay to be honest about that. I imagine Paul and Silas, they didn't know which personal boundaries would be crossed on this journey. I guess just knowing the Lord maybe was enough for them. He changed their lives, and so they risked it for him. But are you willing, even on other non-physically threatening situations, to let other people encroach a bit on your personal boundaries, on your safety, on your confidence? To laugh at you if you open your mouth for a God who's changed your life but that can't be seen? They risked their freedom, their health, and safety for Jesus. A final obstacle I want to touch on, and I'd love to send you on this homework task to maybe go through the whole book of Acts this summer and pick out the challenges, the barriers that come up for the gospel, and extend this list, and then prayerfully consider where God has you in this whole story. The obstacle of the limit of his own strength. Paul was near death at this point. Clearly, his physical strength and lifeblood was just about spent. He needed the Almighty to step in the form of other followers of Christ. And they interceded on the spot. The text says almost embarrassingly simply, but after the disciples gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. No drum roll, no hocus pocus, no fancy incantations or anything, no trickery. It's just the simple statement. The disciples gathered around him, and he got up. I imagine they prayed for him. I imagine they interceded with all the emotion of that moment. And so Paul, who had just healed a paralyzed man in the name of Christ, himself now requires healing. And for Jesus to reach into his situation at the brink of death through people of faith surrounding him. It's a powerful little encounter here in chapter 14. So I ask this question in closing: which obstacles of Christ and his gospel do you imagine are you willing to face? What price are you willing to pay? Nowadays, we as Christians in the West, we have maybe diverse, different obstacles than these. We don't have any stonings. I've never encountered anyone wanting to slay any animals to praise me. I don't know if you have. I imagine you haven't. I have nobody labeling us or riling up crowds because of our presence. But the world's a big place, and not everything is the West. These kinds of terrible, aggressive reactions do take place, reactions to the gospel in our world today. In many parts of North Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, East Asia, South America, Christians may not only face obstacles affecting their relationships and their reputations as store owners, as teachers, as people in the community, but their homes and their businesses can be at risk, and often their security and life itself. People have had to pay with their lives. And then on the other hand, the point of today's message isn't about just building awareness to these obstacles, but also on how to address them. And maybe if we see brothers and sisters of the faith and what they have gone through, maybe God will use that to kindle a courage in us too, to say, no, geography is not an insurmountable obstacle, or taking some inroads on a language is not impossible for me, or coming out of my comfort zone. I will do that. I know there's people that are waiting for a word from me, and I haven't opened my mouth yet. And then maybe I start to pray differently. Lord, help me with that obstacle. Help me step out of myself a bit. Help me to love you even if there's a risk involved. And then to trust God's grace that he will carry me through whatever reactions or counter-reactions might come. Maybe there's a gracious response. Maybe there's more of an aggressive response, and that he would then help us if we need a defensive sermon or if we need an explanation of grace in that kind of a sermon. Who knows? Which obstacles to the gospel are we called to hurdle personally, as CFC, as a community of believers in KW. I yearn for this church, that this place would initiate vibrant conversation about identifying the challenges and obstacles you face, and the opportunities and resources God has given you. That you could be honest with one another, both about the challenge of sharing the good news of Christ, but also about what obstacles you face. I think that's a great conversation to have. And I think any pastor who sees a church who's in dialogue about proclaiming the gospel in their surroundings, that's an exciting thing to be a part of. I'm excited for you. That's an opportunity to be a church that asks the Lord for help. And maybe the words as I close in Psalm 18, my mom's confirmation verse, would come true for all of us. With your help, the psalmist praises God and says, with your help, I can run through a barricade. With my God, I can scale a wall. May the Lord help us with that as he governs over our own growth and trust in him. So I pray that we would yield to him. God bless you.